Good evening. I would like to welcome you to the ARCO Forum. My name is Melissa Liazos, and I'm an undergraduate at the college and a member of the Projects Committee at the Institute of Politics. The panel discussion we have for you tonight is entitled The Year of the Woman and Beyond. Certainly, in many aspects, this was a year of the women. Women raised unprecedented amounts of money in their campaigns. Record numbers of women were elected to the U.S. House and to the U.S. Senate, as well as at the state and local levels. For the first time, there are two female senators representing one state, namely Barbara Boxer and Diane Feinstein from California. Carol Moseley Braun was the first African-American woman to ever be elected to the U.S. Senate. In the wake of the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings, these women and many others, including one of our panelists, were convinced of the need for more women to run for and be elected to public office. These hearings also brought women's issues to the forefront. Abortion was an especially hot topic, and on its own was a central concern of numerous campaign ads. However, in many ways, it should be upsetting to us that a mere 6 women in the U.S. Senate and 48 women in the House are both records. Clearly, we have come a long way, but we still have a very long way to go. Our panelists tonight will discuss this trend of the Year of the Woman, including its causes and its successes. They will also look to the future and to whether or not this trend will continue and to what it means for the newly elected women and for the women candidates of tomorrow. Tonight, we are honored to have 3 distinguished guests on our panel, each from a different venue, one from a fundraising organization, one a former candidate, and one an elected official. They will be further introduced by our moderator, who is Barbara Piper. Ms. Piper is a Republican woman and she's pro-choice. She is a fellow here at the Institute of Politics and the chair of the California Republican Party Women's Task Force. She is also a member of the Los Angeles County Board of Education, and she is the former mayor of La Canada Flint Ridge. I'm sure we're all anxious to hear what our panelists have to say, and so without further ado, I'll turn the podium over to Barbara Piper. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction and the overview, and what a wonderful group we have here tonight. I know we're going to have some fabulous questions, and it's my honor to introduce our panelists. On the note that in 46 states there are no senators, and in 26 states there are no women congressmen, women senators, women congressmen. After our panel tonight, you'll know that it will be different. Even in the next year of the woman and the following year of the woman as they continue. Our panelists tonight are Jane Danowitz, and to my immediate left, Jane is, and many of you know this already, is Executive Director of the Women's Campaign Fund, and it is the nation's oldest and largest bipartisan political committee. How well I know it's bipartisan, they supported me in my race last spring, and I was very appreciative of that. In 1992, it was predicted that the Women's Campaign Fund would provide nearly $1 million in cash and technical assistance to close to 200 bipartisan pro-choice women candidates running for state and national office. Jane is responsible for the Candidate Services Program, and that supports the women running throughout the nation, either at federal or state and local levels, and the District of Columbia. And she directs in the mail program, and the organization, through her work, has more than doubled its support to candidates. It's a marvelous record, and is looked to nationally as one of the powerhouses for women in the United States of America. Just as a little interesting aside, Jane has, of course, had much national press and appeared in many places, but you might like to know a little bit about her education. She is a cum laude graduate of Cornell University and received her law degree from Catholic University in 1979. She's a member of the District of Columbia Bar and President's Council of Cornell Women. Our next panelist, many of you know because you might have had the opportunity to vote for her if you live in Massachusetts around Fenway Park. You might have attended her study group. She's been one of our fellow presenters here, Diane Wilkerson, who is one of the newest senators in the state of Massachusetts, the only Afro-American woman senator in the state of Massachusetts. She has been legal counsel for the NAACP. As you know, she is an attorney and has formerly been associated with the firm of Roche, Carens, and De Giacomo. And it's a special pleasure that we have Diane in her dynamic way, as all women do, multiple jobs, not only running a study group, but running a successful state Senate campaign. Our third member of the panel, many of us know, many of you were rooting her on during election eve, Lynn Yackel. Lynn entered the race for U.S. Senator in Pennsylvania in February of this year. She had never before run for public office. Stepping into the arena, she had 1% name recognition. It's pretty brave, Lynn. That was in March. She was in a 5-way race for the Democratic nomination, and she ran against the party-endorsed lieutenant governor, and she won the primary in a landslide victory by the end of April this year. She faced 2-term incumbent Republican Senator Arlen Spector, and she's honest, she's honest. She was in a real squeaker, and it was a late night. We were talking about that. It was up, it was down. It did not turn out in Lynn's favor, 47% from the November 3rd election. Prior to entering this race, and I think it was a very successful race when you come in with 1% recognition and come with a 2% margin at the end. She was president and CEO of Women's Way, and at the first and largest women's funding federation in the nation. We have a fabulous panel before us. I'm excited to hear what they have to say. Ladies, you are welcome to sit there or come to the podium as you wish. We will go with your desires. Fire away. Jane.
Let me say I'm very glad you hissed more for Arlen Spector than Cornell. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening and to be with such a wonderful group of women up front. As I look around the room here, I see all sorts of future Congress people and senators and governors and even presidents, and that's only among the women that I'm looking at. So. But I'm here to say, lest you have no doubt, the rhetoric has become a reality, and this has been the year of the woman. We have achieved and accomplished, to use the term of physics, critical mass, which is, and we will never go back. I think one of the best signs is that we now have an African-American woman in Diane representing Fenway Park, and I think that says it all. But as you know, we have six new women, we have 6 women now in the Senate. We have 48 women in the House of Representatives. We picked up 24, and we will never go back. And I think it's fair to say, when all is said and done, that we will never again have a Senate Judiciary Committee that is all white and all male. And we are never going to have a House or a Senate that pays only lip service to critical issues that affect more than half the population, be it the environment or health care or reproductive choice or education. Our issues really, like our candidates, have become mainstream. I'd like to say we're no longer in the Bush leagues, but we're really in a league of our own, and we have elected this time around a really strong lineup of women, a new team that is going to go to bat for all of our issues, be they health care, reproductive choice, a better environment, and certainly improved economy. I think it also helps that we have a new coach in Governor Bill Clinton, and a White House and a Congress that I think will work together. Let's talk a little bit about the numbers. You know, 6 new women in the Senate. 4 new women in the Senate makes a total of 6. Carol Moseley Braun, of course, the 2 wonderful women from California, Diane Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, and then our mom in tennis shoes from Washington State, Patty Murray. We also have 24 new women in the House of Representatives. We now have 48. 21 of the 24 Democratic. And it's fair to say that this Congress is going to be a class of firsts. We have Carol Moseley Braun, the first African-American woman in the United States Senate. We have Barbara Boxer and Diane Feinstein, the first 2 women ever elected to represent a state. We also have women like Carrie Meek and Corinne Brown from Florida, who are the first African-American legislators elected from their state since Reconstruction, and a number of African-American women from the South who are the first African-American women to be elected from their state since Reconstruction. Nydia Velazquez in New York is the first Puerto Rican woman ever elected to the House. Lucille Roble Allard in California is the first Mexican-American woman ever elected to the House. And then, of course, we have Barbara Boxer, who will be the first woman to wear boxer shorts in the United States Senate. We also have women who are the first representatives from their states ever to serve: Pennsylvania, Marjorie Margolis-Medinski, and Leslie Byrne in Virginia. And so I think it's fair to say we've come a long way in the congressional ranks. In the state and local levels, which we really haven't paid a whole lot of attention to, Pam Carter becomes the nation's first African-American Attorney General from Indiana. She joins now, I think, 7 women who are their state's attorney generals, and with critical issues such as domestic violence and reproductive choice on the agenda, that is going to be an important place for women to be. We also have the first African-American sheriff ever elected in this country, Jackie Barrett, from all places but Georgia. This has been really a Democratic year, and the Republican women have, as Barbara probably knows, not been critical players as they should have been in this year. The class is overwhelmingly Democratic. There were 11 women who were their nominees for the United States Senate, 10 of whom were Democratic. The only Republican was a woman named Charlene Harr in South Dakota, and she ran against Tom Daschle in the nuts and bolts of her campaign. She put recipes in her campaign literature and campaigned as Mrs. Harr. The Republicans, I think, really wasted their most valuable resource in a time when people being progressive on social issues and being conservative on economic issues are ideal candidates. They really lost an opportunity by not pushing forward more women into the ranks and into the House and the Senate this year. Money is obviously critical this year. Barbara Boxer, for example, had 80,000 donors when all was said and done. Geraldine Farrar in New York didn't make it, but she had 50,000. Lynn, I don't even know, you had something that was 50,000, equally astronomical. I think it's important that most of these donors were women. And so that through these elections, we may have not have had all the successes that we wanted, but we have laid the base. We have laid the base across the country, a women's financial network who will come back again and raise money for more women candidates. I think the big story this year is diversity, however. We talked a lot about the firsts in terms of women of color, but I think when all is said and done, when women voters look at this 103rd Congress, whether they're old or young or rich or poor or black or white, or whether they have careers or they stay at home, they're going to see someone in that House of Representatives and in that United States Senate that looks like them, and I think that's critical. I call it the doctrine of comparable worth, because I think it's finally women are being acknowledged and applauded for those experiences that are unique for us, and they have been able to campaign openly on them. I use Lynn Woolsey, for example, Marin County, California, just elected to Congress. She is filling the shoes of Barbara Boxer. It's a fairly wealthy district, and yet she campaigned as a welfare mother, a woman who had to raise her children without health insurance. Patty Murray didn't talk about being a state legislator. She talked about being a mom in tennis shoes. She talked about the problems, and the reason she ran for office was because her children weren't getting an adequate education. Marjorie Margolis-Medinski in Pennsylvania, she didn't talk about, she talked about being a single woman who adopted, was the first woman in this country to adopt refugee children. She talked about all the Vietnamese children she had brought over after the war, and so on and so forth. And I think it bodes well for women in the future because we don't have to campaign like men. We don't have to talk about our CEO experiences. We don't have to talk about how tough we are. We can talk about the experiences that we bring to the table, and that's compromise, compassion, and we finally have credibility. I want to talk a little bit about some factors that were crucial in this election, and I call them the 7 C's. C as in, not as Cornell, but crimson. Although after we got through our dinner discussion, I think there's about 13 or 14 of them. But let me just start. Obviously, first and foremost is Clarence Thomas. We can't thank him enough. Um, but it was clearly, when all was said and done, whether you believed Anita or Clarence or whatever you thought about those hearings, it really was the first time that the American voter, American people, looked into the halls of Congress. And they saw for the first time that there were no women, there were no blacks, there weren't anybody who really looked like them. And they didn't like it. And it was really the best unpaid advertising for electing women to office we ever had. It was really the first time this year that I can remember that we didn't have to go through the rigmarole of explaining why we need more women in office. It was obvious and patently clear. We could go on to the business of electing them. And so it was critical. It's critical in terms of fundraising. Women's Campaign Fund, similar, I think, to most organizations that raise money on behalf of women candidates. Our contributions doubled this year. Emily's List, as many of you know, is the largest PAC in the country. They're bigger than the Teamsters and the Realtors this year. And what do? They raise money for Democratic women. And so it was a tremendous boost. Change. Obviously, very critical. The ultimate irony, perhaps, of this election is women have been locked out for so long, we're outside the process, and that became an attribute. And we were the ultimate agents of change, and the voters saw us as that, and they elected us on those bases. Clinton-Gore coattails. What I think were in the summertime skirt tails turned into coattails in some cases, and I think it was actually a nice turn of events. Women elected Clinton-Gore really in record numbers, went out to support them, and credit where credit is due. I think Clinton and Gore were critical in certain races, such as California with Barbara Boxer, in pulling her over a last-minute hurdle that she had to overcome. And yet I think the excitement that surrounded women candidates, particularly early on in the year, was very, very critical in terms of the support, the early support that Clinton-Gore had among women, and it never left. Crossover votes, we talked about it, and I think it's linked with choice as well. Women candidates are really ideal because they're able to attract voters that, frankly, their male counterparts can't. And so we saw women in critical districts, swing districts, attract support cross-party lines, and it was critical to a lot of their victories. Checks and cheats, as it were. Women are seen, and rightly so I might add, as being more ethical and more honest, and women were able to I know that'll get a question. Women were able to capitalize on that, and in some cases, for example, in Arkansas, where Blanche Lambert beat a man who had bounced 242 checks, were able to say, hey, look, we bring change, we bring honesty, and we bring ethics to a body that desperately needs it. Couple of sort of, I won't say down notes, but things I think that are really present the challenges ahead. One is challengers. When all was said and done, only 4 women in the House and 1 in the Senate defeated a sitting member of Congress, and 2 in the primary in terms of the House, 2 in the general. That means that the power of the incumbency, the power and the perks that incumbent members have still remains. And when you're talking about a body that only has 48 women in the House and six in the Senate, you realize that there are a lot more male incumbents than female. And I think that's going to be a tremendous challenge, particularly because we're not going to be able to enjoy the fruits and the spoils of redistricting for another 10 years, which gave us a tremendous leg up this time around. And finally, one of my favorites is the crazies. All you have to do is turn on the McLaughlin Group to know Pat Buchanan is back. But I think one of the negative, real downsides of this campaign that has not been talked about is what the religious right, what the Christian coalition did in the 11th hour to really destroy the campaigns of tremendous women. Barbara Christmas and Kathy Steinberg in Georgia, Patty Garamendi in California, and Pat Malberg in California. These women were attacked. They were leafleted at their churches for doing such things as taking money from the National Organization for Women, or taking money for the Hollywood Women's Political Caucus because, my goodness, Jane Fonda sits on the board. That Jane Fonda who lives with Ted Turner, I might add. They were denounced for their choice positions. It came very much as a stealth movement, 11th hour, and I think it's an issue with which women are much more vulnerable than men. There were few survivors. Karen English, for example, the first woman to be elected from Arizona, ran against a man, Doug Weed, who sits in on occasion for Pat Robertson. And he was so wacko, I guess, that she got the support in the closing days of the campaign from Barry Goldwater. And I always say, he wants to go to heaven. What can I? God's a woman. I think probably the greatest challenge, and I know that the other panelists are going to talk about it, however, is what we're going to do after this. November 3rd is not the end. It is only a beginning. We have elected a record number of women. These women have been elected on a mandate of change and make a difference. And here we are, only a handful of women in the Senate and a little more than a handful in the House. And we have set our sights very, very high. We are going to have to make a difference. We're going to have to get critical legislation passed, be it family medical leave, the Freedom of Choice Act, protecting reproductive choice. We're going to have to do something about health care, the economy. The list goes on and on. But I'm very confident. Women are the ultimate compromisers and consensus makers. All you have to do is know who arbitrated your dinner tables every night when you were growing up to know that it wasn't a man. And I think all the women in this room will agree that women have long had a roadmap for the future. And I think after these elections, we're finally in the driver's seat. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Those were wonderful insights and a good national overview. Diane Wilkerson, please.
Good evening. I'm going to repeat some of what we talked about earlier, but the first thing I would like to say is that I am so nervous about the wholesale buying into the phrase that this is the year of the women. I've said before, I went to Kenya in 1985 for the United Nations Conference, and we got a decade then. It was called the Decade of Women. So if the UN was willing to give us 10 years, I'm hoping that this is going to buy us more than one. Because certainly that is, I think, in the back of many women's minds, one of the concerns, and if it isn't, it ought to be, and that is that people take that phrase literally and think that we have arrived. I, as was said earlier, ran for the state Senate seat in a district that encompasses, for those of you who know anything about Boston, it starts in Mattapan, goes through Dorchester, goes through Roxbury, goes into the South End, into Bay Village, into the Back Bay, to Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, and far over is Fenway Park. 60% African American, about 11% Latino. We have the largest gay and lesbian population in the Commonwealth in this district. We have the wealthiest precincts in the city of Boston in the district. We have the poorest precinct in the city of Boston in the district. And the list just goes on. Diversity was the buzzword when we started. I'm a Democrat, ran against a 12-year incumbent, and it started off 3 other, and 1 dropped out, so it became 2 other, all male candidates, all black male candidates to be exact. It was clear to me early on that this election was going to be a referendum on the future of the cities, and particularly urban areas like Boston, and much like what was going on for the rest of the country. It garnered, contrary to most of the other Senate races in the Commonwealth, probably more media attention, but for all the wrong reasons, I will say. I mean, the media had a virtual field day in the level of nastiness, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. But I wanted to start with a discussion about diversity, and I'm going to end with that same discussion, because it certainly played a major role in what happened in that district. Massachusetts certainly has one of the oldest state legislatures in the country, had never until last Tuesday anyway, had an African American female in the state Senate. So for a number of reasons, it's going to be a very new and different place. Massachusetts, and particularly Boston, I've always said, is a city of contradictions. It is a city where you will find, and particularly in a district like the senatorial district that I represent, we have what I refer to as the most of the worst and the least of the best. And in fact, that is the challenge for the political representation from that district. There was something I think that was very different about the Senate race that I was involved in than other Senate races, and certainly one was the level of nastiness, but we didn't deal with it on it wasn't so much, it wasn't a race issue, as I said, that all of the candidates were black male. There was no Republican challenger. We had one independent who, it turns out, was the former chief aide to the incumbent that I ran about. So after beating the incumbent by a 3-1 margin in the primary, I then ran against his former legislative aide in the final election. And so I say to people, I actually ran against the incumbent twice, except from between September to November, it was the incumbent times 2. But it was fascinating in the sense that it was clearly one of the nastiest on the statewide level. There was a lot of questions and discussions early on about whether women could handle that. And because I knew all of the candidates that were running in the primary when we started this, I remember back in June when I had the kickoff, and I said that they should be aware that I had been trained as a mother, you know. And so when you have that kind of training, you literally have to be prepared for anything. Mothers, I think, one of the weapons that we used, I had people that would watch me on TV early on, and I remember the first television show that I did, someone called the next morning and said, and left a message on my voicemail and said, Diane, you have got to work on those faces. That even when you weren't talking, we knew exactly what you were thinking because we were reading your face. And I decided, contrary to the political wisdom, that if that was true, then I intended to use that for every bit that I could. And I really do believe, and it is not sexist to say, I remember my mother, I have 11 brothers and sisters, and when my mother would take us out, she could not spank us in public. So she developed this whole repertoire of faces. And we all knew what they meant. And there was like a catalog of one that said, don't do that again. And there was one that said, you're skating close to the edge. And then there was the face that said, it's too late, you're dead. And so, we always say, I don't want to be like my mother, but one of the things that I am proud to say that I inherited from my mother was her repertoire of faces. And so I began to use them, and I said, I am not at all going to try to stop and be stone-faced. In fact, I think that's one of the things that would be a benefit. And I used that, and I could tell people things without opening my mouth. And so we did, things like local television shows and the Sunday morning news shows, whenever, the candidate or my opponent was talking, I would just go into my faces. And so people would say, boy, he's stupid. We could tell what you thought by looking, and you would shake your head or you'd roll your eyes to the top of your head. And see, but women can do that kind of stuff. And people do read your face. And so it was one of the things that I just decided I would keep it, I would live with it, and I would use that. And I do it. And part of it is just a habit, and it was one that I also acknowledged I could not break. But I decided to run for state senate because I was concerned about the kinds of things that I saw happening in the district that I lived in, the district that I cared about. I am an attorney by profession, came here to Boston College to go to law school, and stayed. And when I moved here, I came here, I said we came east from Springfield, Massachusetts, so I was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, if you can believe. And people used to ask me, and I would say Arkansas, and they say, what? How do you pronounce that? And I'd say, if nothing else, Bill Clinton legitimized my birthplace, because nobody cared to know anything about Arkansas until he came along. But it really was important, and I think it is true to say that this election was about the future. This was an election about our future. And we really we set out in the process, one, to do voter registration. We registered a record number of voters in the city of Boston, and I think that it's something that really played itself out across the country. That one of the more interesting things were the comments that came from both men and women about this election. Because it was so easy for people to make this a he against she race, because all of the opponents were male. And I can tell you that there were as many men who said, and only they could say it, and I used to tell them, only you can get away with this. You say, those knuckleheads, those jerks, let's throw out the dogs and bring in the cats. This is my favorite saying. Some man walked up to me and said this. But that contrary to popular belief, that the whole issue of support for women was as much an issue for the men that live in the 2nd Suffolk District as it was for the women. So it was the year of the women, but that was the result and not how it happened, because in fact, it did take an enormous amount of involvement by men and women to make this happen. And so when you live in a city that is, you know, we have the worst health indicators. We have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. We have one of the highest heart disease, heart attack rates for people of color, and everything, whatever you can imagine. We have one of the highest school dropout rates for Latino children in high school in this city. And just a real serious and honest belief that it didn't have to be this way. I do not believe it. If I believed that it had to be this way, I wouldn't have been running, but I don't. And I do not believe that it is fair nor accurate to say that women have all the right answers. But I think we have different answers, and I think it is incumbent upon us to try those answers, because we certainly have been trying the other way for a long, long time, and it hasn't worked. And so it is important when you're having discussions about things like education and jobs and the economy and housing and banking and insurance to have representation by what is now 50+% of the population in any discussion that's going to be setting policy in the country. And that was really the message that I talked about. The thing that I think, and then people have different twists on it, but my take on it is this, because we had a record number of women Democratic women that challenged incumbents in our primaries. I think that what happened in the primaries in the states across this country is that when people went to the polls, where you were having to select from different types of candidates in the same party, that people made a conscious decision that they were going to support the women candidates. After those women became the Democratic Party nominees, we then came to the general elections, and there was a different question, a different process, and what people then voted for was change, and voted that the Democratic ticket, and decided that the Democratic nominees, who in Massachusetts, on the whole, happened to be women, became the candidates of choice. So there was two different processes, I believe, that people went through. We have a 40-member Senate in Massachusetts. We had 3. We are going to have 9 women in the Senate in Massachusetts in January. That is a first. We have a very autocratic Senate process, like most states. I ran into former Senator Paul Tsongas and former presidential candidate Paul Tsongas about 3 weeks ago at a dinner. I was talking to him about the race, and they flashed the lights, and we had for people to be seated. And I was walking away, and he said, I just got to say one thing. And this devilish look on his face, and he said, "You're going to drive them crazy." And he was laughing when he said it. And so, and I know what he meant. You have to just know. And I don't think you have to know something particularly any different about Massachusetts Senate than you do about whatever Senate body from wherever you are. Just imagine what it's like when you walk into a situation where all of a sudden you've got to deal with these people, you know, and we're going to have 9. And one of the major issues that we're going to be discussing in our Senate is welfare reform. And knowing that was one of the real important issues for me, because I could not imagine the body as presently constituted deciding welfare reform in such an important time in this country's history, that welfare reform has got to be something more than deciding that all of the people, half of the people who are eligible today are going to be ineligible tomorrow. That's been our reform. It's just cut people off the rolls. It's more than that. You know, I am very excited about hearing Bill Clinton's ideas about reform. What I'm concerned about is how they intend to do it. I think we all agree that reform ought to be about moving people out, that welfare ought to be temporary. What happens is that we punish people for wanting a better life, and we've got to factor in a process that is going to make it possible for people to work themselves out. If you can imagine that the Republican government proposal in Massachusetts for welfare reform is to give people a budget, give them a time on which to get off welfare. If they do not get off in that time, to turn the family over to a conservator, and they're going to place the welfare families in the Commonwealth in conservatorship. Aside from being patently unconstitutional, it is scary to think that these are educated, you know, rational, I thought, and conscious people who have come up with this idea as a process to reform welfare. That is not the way to do it. I have never met these people that they talk about who kind of get up in the morning and say, I'm going to have 3 or 4 kids and live on welfare and see how much fun that is. It just doesn't happen that way. I don't know anybody that thinks it's fun. There is nothing well nor fair about our welfare system, and it doesn't have to be that way. I am a former AFDC recipient, which in Massachusetts means welfare, and I say that because people need to understand that there is nobody in that Senate body who could know more and know better, if that's proper English, than I about what it means, and have a very specific plan about how we create a process that rewards people for wanting out. And it sounds simple, but it is doable. And I know we're going to do it. We're going to do it. The last thing I'm going to say, because I want to leave time for questions, but I want to say this, and that is that given the diversity and the makeup of the district that I ran in, one of the things that was very important to me is the knowledge that we needed to have the cooperation of all of those different factors and factions of people involved in this process. And the only way to do that was to work across the district and talk to people and listen to them, but also to avoid what I believe that politicians are so apt to fall into, and that is the ease at which they allow themselves to be pitted, one constituency against the other. And the most disappointing thing for me was, because I really believe that we had an opportunity to change this from the national ticket on down, was that Bill Clinton didn't take that opportunity. And for most of it, I'm a Bill Clinton supporter. I campaigned for him, and despite some of the backsliding that we saw in the last several weeks of the campaign, because there was Perot had an office in the middle of the minority community and never closed it, even when he came out of the race. And so he did very well in some of those districts, but I'm happy to say that Bill Clinton actually won Boston on my coattails, because I did campaign for him, and I do believe that he was the person. But I will tell you that it is possible to fight the urge and the pulling that happens when you are a politician, and we had to deal with it. And I talked about the makeup of the constituency. The gay and lesbian community said to me, "What are you going to say to the minority community and the religious community and the minority community when they tell you that our lifestyle is a sin and that they don't want you to support us?" I said, what I'm going to say to them is that if you were standing before God, he would take you as you are. And certainly we cannot have a higher test and a higher standard than God. God wouldn't dismiss them, then I would not either. And I had the same questions that came from the Jewish community, who didn't understand why I would have someone like a Minister Don Mohammed in the Nation of Islam being a supporter and part of my campaign. Politicians, you do not have, and we should not exercise ever the luxury of picking and choosing which of the constituents that you represent. I take everybody or I take none. And that was my response when I was asked. And I said, if you want to support me, you're going to have to buy into this notion that if the condition for your support is that I disassociate, then I can't have your support, because I'm not going to do it. And having said that, and everybody and everywhere I went will tell you that. And having said that, I won 58 of 58 precincts. And this is the first time I ever run for public office. But people were ready, and there was a message. And you do not have to buy into the pitting in order to gain support. And it depends. Semantics is everything, and language is everything, and it depends on how you say it. And when you put it out there like that, how can anybody argue with that? That I could not pick and choose which of my constituents that I was going to represent. It was an all or none. And they are comfortable with what I said. They may not even be comfortable with the issues, and one of my favorite lines I used to tell them is that the conflict between the Muslim and the Jewish community is 2,000 years old, and it was not going to be resolved in the context of my campaign before November 3rd. And so while I was certainly willing, to at least create the stage for it to be discussed, that there is no way that I have ever seen anybody resolve issues unless they communicate. And that was the first requirement. There was room on the stage for members of the Jewish community, for members of the gay and lesbian community, for members of the Latino and African and American community, and they bought it, and they accepted it. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be continue that kind of momentum and that kind of coalition. But I believe that that the city of Boston looks like what this country looks like, and that it is representative of that total package, and it is only through that kind of coalition are we going to get out of this rut. And I am excited about the challenge. And I tell people every day, if I could start tomorrow, I would, but I am ready. And that's it.
Thank you, Diane. You know, over a century ago, there was a rhyme locally, here's to the city of Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells speak only to Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God. Somehow, at the end of this century, I think there are a few people who are going to have to answer to Diane Wilkerson. Len Yackel.
Thank you. After hearing your wonderful reception to it when my opponent's name was announced, I was wishing I could have moved all of you to Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago. We needed just a few more votes. I want to start by quoting Adlai Stevenson, who actually has many, many quotes which I have loved during the course of this experience. But this one was one that he said on one of the occasions when he lost an election. He said, "I'm too old to cry and I'm too young to quit." And that's how I'm feeling about this election. I have had an extraordinary 9-month journey, and I think frequently about the 9-month symbolism because it really was exactly that amount of time from the time I entered the Senate race until the due date of November the 3rd. And it really has been, it's been beyond anything I could have ever imagined, and of course it's been part of what we couldn't have possibly anticipated, which was this tidal wave of change and this convergence of factors which were facilitated by the Women's Campaign Fund and Emily's List and the National Women's Political Caucus, and also by those of us who individually and independently made our decisions to step forward and try to do something about our government. And so all of us coming together in this year created what has been called the Year of the Woman. But I'm going to paint a somewhat less rosy picture of it than Jane did because of the experience that I had, which has some slightly different messages. First of all, the narrow defeat that we had on November the 3rd could lead to a sense of sadness. And yet, for me, that's not the emotion at all. Because the fact that I did, and my campaign did, come out of nowhere, which is the way that it was often described, and nearly unseat an entrenched, powerful, well-financed epitome of the political system, Arlen Spector, who symbolizes the power of incumbency and who really represents what I think we need to look at in terms of our political system. The fact that we nearly did that, it gives me an enormous sense of exhilaration and enormous hope for the future and for what we can accomplish. The encouragement that I had from the fact that starting with 1% name recognition, that we received on November the 3rd 2.2 million votes in Pennsylvania, which was about the same number that Bill Clinton got in Pennsylvania. Of course, he was in a three-way race, but it still was kind of an amazing number, that there were that many people who thought I would have been a better senator, a better choice than Arlen Spector as a two-term incumbent. That's cause for great encouragement. On the negative side, the narrow loss leads to a temptation to swear off politics. It also, on the negative side, the fact of the complete loss of privacy and the exposure not only of my life but of my family's life to this incredible scrutiny that a high-profile race such as mine brought about, although anyone who runs for office is subjected to this, and it is definitely something to be reckoned with. The fact that I was the victim of ridiculous charges from my opponent, absolutely inexcusable, outrageous, ridiculous charges, that was very much a negative in this. And that the whole obstacle of taking on an opponent who had so much money, who had so many power perks, so many things to trade, so many IOUs out there to collect, those are not things that I consider fun in particular. But it was something that really needed to be done, and again, when I look at the overall, on the positive side, I would not have missed this experience for the world. I absolutely wouldn't not do it, knowing everything I know at this point. It was just an incredible experience. It was exciting, it was encouraging, and it was educational. And so what I want to say a little bit about is lessons learned in the course of this 9 months, and what I think these lessons have to say about politics in America in 1992, and about some of the work that we have ahead of us. Because I think we have made enormous progress this year, albeit, you know, when you look at the total scheme of things, we still have very small numbers in terms of women at the national level. And the reality is that none of the well-financed, entrenched incumbents in the Senate was defeated. The women who won their races, Jane said one was running against an incumbent, but it was really an appointee. I assume you're talking about Feinstein. Oh, well, she defeated him in the primary, though, right, yes, which was very, very different. But in any case, the fact is that D'Amato, Packwood, and Spector all were reelected, despite the fact that they were in very difficult, challenging races, and this was supposed to have been the year of anti-incumbency fever, the year of the outsider, and that sort of thing. So I want to say a little bit about what I think that means about the political process. Some of the lessons learned were pleasant, some were painful. The first thing that I learned is that there is an incredible spirit of citizenship everywhere in this land. It's a spirit of citizenship that's just waiting to be ignited. It needs something or someone to ignite it. I found it everywhere I went, not only in Pennsylvania, but all across this country, where I campaigned during the summer raising money, where I spent a lot of time in cities all over the United States, and I found this tremendous interest in the political system from people who had not been interested. In my case, at this time last year, I was a private citizen beginning to think about whether I wanted to take this on, getting lots of calls from people saying, you've got to run against Arlen Spector. It's something we have to do. We've got to get him out of the Senate. And I was really considering whether to take the step. But what ignited the citizenship motive for me was the judiciary hearings, which were the last straw, not the only straw, but the last straw in what I considered to be a decline in the quality of life and in the quality of leadership in this country. And that, for me, was the primary motivating force. Having been working in the private sector for 2 decades, raising money for programs that were helping families get off the welfare rolls, that were providing job training and housing and health care and emergency services, domestic violence shelter and legal help, I had seen what had happened with the federal government's abandonment of our cities, of our social welfare programs. And so, you know, my sense was, this is enough. It's time to step forward and do something. And that's a response that I think is a citizen's response that was very exciting in terms of what happened this year. Because I did find that everywhere there is a belief that we have lost integrity in public service in this country, that the political system has become a very frightening system that is driven by money and power and greed, and that very often attracts people who have the wrong motives for running, who have the wrong motives for being there, who are not interested in serving the public as much as they are in the perks and the power and the privilege, and who are almost impossible to get out of office. And so that is, I believe, a very pervasive notion, and one that I think we saw in the 2.2 million votes in Pennsylvania, which were citizens' votes for me, a citizen who was trying to do something about this system. The citizens that I encountered all over Pennsylvania who were seeking change, I will capture in a couple of examples. And these were multiplied hundreds and thousands of times. Pennsylvania is a very large state. It's very diverse. It's very rural. It has 2 cities which are like complete opposites, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But there were some themes. In Tyrone, Pennsylvania, which is in a very depressed part of the state, in a rural part, there was a woman I met who had been just laid off from her job as a garment worker. She was a single mother of 2 children. She was laid off with no benefits at all. She had no health insurance for herself or her children, no job prospects. She wanted help, and she wanted somebody who could identify and understand what those issues were about. In Erie, I met a father of 4 daughters 2 of whom were in college. He was holding down 2 jobs, and he said to me, please help me get my children to college. I want them to have college educations. We can't afford to send them to college. Pennsylvania happens to rank 50th out of the 50 states in the state's contribution to higher education, public higher education. It has become a privilege of the wealthy to go to college in Pennsylvania. In Scranton, I met a college student who was terrified of graduating because he said, there are no jobs out there. I'm going to have to move out of the state. Many young people have moved out of the state of Pennsylvania, leaving us with the 2nd largest elderly population in the country because there are no jobs available. Those were the kinds of issues and the kinds of voices that I heard all across Pennsylvania, and they were the people who also came forward to vote. New people entered the process, especially women. There were many, many women, many of whom had been Republicans, but they weren't really actively involved in any case, but who got involved in my campaign, who wrote their first political checks, who did their first volunteer work for a political candidate, and who really became shareholders in what turned into a huge grassroots effort. We did have over 50,000 financial contributors, and this again was over a 9-month period. Most of the other women who had been running and other people had been running for some time. But over 9 months, we attracted 50,000 contributors who contributed over $4.5 million. Many of those contributions were very small. We had over 10,000 volunteers. We had a very large and very grassroots campaign. And it was wonderful because those people are going to stay in the process. And that's what this election has done that I think is so important, this election year has done. The second lesson I learned is that I had picked a formidable mountain to climb. And I knew that going in, but I will tell you, what I learned about the political process and the power of incumbency is really, I mean, we all know it's there, but it's very real. He had money, a lot of it, money that had been raised over 6 years, a war chest that was right there to start attacking me on the day after I won the primary and had to go back to raising money. He ended up outspending me more than 2 to 1. He spent over $9 million and broke all records for spending on a Senate race in Pennsylvania, including John Heinz's record. He had favors, he had trade-offs, he had false charges and slanted sound bites, all of which were part of the process. He went on television 2 months almost before we had the money to go on, and during that time erased the negative images of the Anita Hill questioning by talking about all the wonderful things that he had done for Pennsylvania, raised his positives and set himself up to attack me. You know, it was an issue of money. I had not been trained in that sport, the sport of the false charges and the kinds of nastiness that were in this race. And by the way, these were the same tactics used in the other races, so this was nothing new. This was, Arlen Spector's campaign has been called a textbook campaign, and I just wrote an op-ed piece for the Philadelphia paper in which I said, if that is so, that textbook is what is wrong with politics in America. Because it is a book, it's a book that rewards all kinds of slanderous accusations, false charges, money as power, and all the things that I think are what make it so difficult for women to break into the system and really for citizens to step forward. Oddly enough, I had the strangest thing happen on Saturday. I had a box of materials from my campaign that had been given to me, things that people had sent me. And I was carrying this box out of my car into my house, and sitting in the box, right sort of buried in things, was a book that was entitled Bigotry, and it was in quotes, and it had an exclamation point, and it said, Ethnic and Sexual Politics in a Senatorial Campaign. I thought, what in the world is this book? No one could possibly have written a book about my election quite this fast. But I picked it up, and it was the story of Genevieve Blatt, who is the only other woman from Pennsylvania who has ever run for the United States Senate. Genevieve Blatt ran in 1962, 30 years ago, against Hugh Scott, who was a Republican who was well entrenched, who was well financed, who in many ways was very much like Arlen Spector, who would do whatever it takes. And I tell you, I picked this book up. It had been sent to me by the author, who wrote a little note saying that she hoped that things would be different this year. But it was my story. Genevieve Blatt ran in a multi-way Democratic primary, unseating the party-endorsed candidate, who was a very powerful judge. And then she lost the general election to Hugh Scott by 70,000 votes. And he charged her with bigotry and all the same kinds of tactics that my opponent used against me. And I thought, that was 30 years ago. And it's really kind of amazing. I'm going to write more on that subject because she's a judge now in the Commonwealth Court in Pennsylvania and had therefore not been free to talk with me in any detail. I had spoken with her once, but it's kind of strange. Anyway, during the course of the campaign, what I wanted to talk about were jobs, education, and health care, which are the major things on the minds of the people of Pennsylvania and America. But what instead we had to talk about were attacks on my husband, my father, my church, all these things that were part of my life that had nothing really to do with me as a candidate or only peripherally. And then we had to deal with the inequality, as I say, the lack of a fair fight in terms of the money. However, during the course of all of this, we did awaken the interest of young people and of women. And, that was the exciting part, and it's the part that I think will last and the part that will make a different outcome the next time. But the bad news is that old-style politics did prevail in this election year, not only in Pennsylvania, but all over this country, where most incumbents, over 90% of incumbents, were reelected in national races this year. And that tells us something about the system. A third lesson I learned is about the media and how the media treats women differently from men. And this is something that all of us need to look at because it's something that's very serious. I don't remember reading stories about any of the male candidates in which their hair was described or their clothes were described or their jewelry was described. And every single piece that was written about me not only did that, but my age was always there. The New York Times had done a piece during the primary in which they listed Arlen Spector and Stephen Friend, who was running against him in the Republican primary, and all of us major contenders in the Democratic primary, all of whom were male. I was the only person who had my age after my name. That's the truth. The other thing is, I was on a couple of television talk shows, and in one case, there were some people in the audience who made a comment, but in another case, there were phone calls that came in that my skirt was too short. And I was really, which it wasn't too short, but but just to give you a sense, it really is something that we need to look at, and we need to hold the media accountable, and it's work that I think all of us need to do who care about this. Another thing is that in my campaign, the mistakes that I made, mispronunciations or little things, all were picked up and repeated by the media. Nothing that my opponent did was he held accountable for. And he lied. All kinds of things happened, which he got away with. And this is absolutely true. And I don't think it was a challenger incumbent thing as much as it was, another kind of a bias that's sort of built in. Now, the positive lesson I learned is what's possible. And this is really the bottom line here. Because a lot is possible, and what I know we have accomplished from this race is reflected in mail that I have been receiving in basket loads every day from all over the United States. Hundreds and hundreds of letters. I've lost track of how many. But today I read two in the car coming here that I'm going to just give you little quotes from because they give you a sense. I received a letter from a woman in Michigan who said, "You inspired many women, some to run for office, others to support women candidates. You showed the way." That message has been repeated over and over in terms of citizens and women getting involved. Another was from a medical student in Philadelphia who wrote, "Your candidacy for the United States Senate, for the first time in my life, represented me and my generation. America recognized that government does not look like us." This goes to what Jane was talking about. Many people tell me that their lives will never be the same because of this campaign. My life certainly will never be the same because of it, but in a very good way. And so I want to say that, you know, what I believe to be true is that the best way to predict the future is to create it. That is the challenge that faces all of us here. It's the challenge that faces me and all the people who believed in this election year and this year of the woman. It's the challenge that faces all of us in America to fulfill the promise of this country, to clean up the system, to help good people get into office, and to really take advantage of the opportunity to control our own lives and control our own futures. That's what I think the 1992 elections are about, and that's what I am committed to work on. And as I said in my non-concession speech on November the 3rd, we've only just begun. Thank you very much.
We've just had 3 tremendous presentations, and now it's our opportunity to open the forum to the people who are here. And in our tradition, the mics are on the forum floor down here. Come forward and identify yourself and ask your question. And while you're coming forward, let's remember that for women candidates, their age is simply that a woman is old as her tongue and a little older than her teeth, and leave it at that. And we'll start off right here.
Thanks. Good evening. I'm Randy Shriver. I'm an MPP1 here. I think it's wonderful that the numbers are increasing, and I sincerely hope that someday the Congress looks exactly like the population. So at the macro level, I think it's great. My problem is at the micro level when you go to pull the lever. I start thinking about the C's you listed, ma'am. Clarence Thomas. People should remember that Nancy Kassebaum voted to confirm him. You know, change. Where does that leave the Kassebaums, Lynn Martin, and others who, you know, don't necessarily reflect that change politically, excuse me. The crazies. There's certainly plenty of wacko right-wing crazy women. So
They all were defeated this year, too.
yeah. So when I pull the lever, should I vote for, and I'm concerned about women's issues, which I am, do I vote for, you mentioned Bob Packwood, somebody who led the fight against Robert Bork because of his opinions on abortion, or do I vote for somebody like Nancy Kassebaum, who voted to confirm Clarence Thomas? As someone concerned with women's issues, is it good enough to say I have XX chromosomes, vote for me?
I'm not sure can answer all the aspects of your questions. A couple things, one of which Nancy Kassebaum, we do know she voted to support Judge Thomas. She's a Republican, and that was her president's nominee. I can say, however, that had she been on that Judiciary Committee, I can guarantee you Arlen Spector would not have behaved the same way that he had if a woman had been on that dais. And I think that's a lot of what all this is about. It's about being in the rooms. It's not about women totally agreeing on all the issues. It's having, as you said, a body that is representative of the population. We're not running as being better. We're not running as being more qualified. We're running because we think we need a seat at the table.
If there are people on the second floor who have questions, just come on down to the forum floor. Thank you. Over here, sir.
Okay, I'd like to address this to all of you. Basically,
And if you'll identify yourself. Thank you.
My name is Joe Grassi, and if you look at the past decade and a half when women have really been out in force running for office, the triumphs have lopsidedly fallen on the Democratic side. And even if you look at the women who didn't win but ran, the Democrats have been split between those with serious contests and those thrown out as sacrificial lambs against entrenched incumbents, whereas the Republicans have overwhelmingly been sacrificial lambs. And my basic question is, why do you think this is so? Do you think this would be so even without the abortion issue? And do you think there's a chance that it might become institutionalized, you know, this advantage that Democrats have, just as it has become with minorities?
And anyone who wants to go first?
I'll just make a general comment about why most of the women who are running are Democrats. And I think we don't have to look any farther than the Republican National Convention. And it's not only the choice issue. It's the issue of family values, you know, and the difference between valuing families, which is what I think that, you know, the Democratic legislators have certainly demonstrated. So that it's, I hope we don't see sacrificial lambs. I certainly didn't see that in this election year. I saw people who were out there giving their hearts and souls, trying to win races, you know, that were very, very difficult. And we all need to look at the best candidates, because I want to just respond to the question over here. I don't think that any of us should be thinking about gender or any single consideration, but who are the best people to lead this nation and to provide the most representative perspectives and experience. We don't have hardly any diversity of perspectives in the United States Congress.
Yeah, I think you can answer that question and the previous question at the same time. I would agree that one of the things, I think the real test was not 92, the test is going to come in 94, 96. Because I have to believe that just as we're sitting here talking about some of the victories, that the Republican Party would need to be sitting down talking about what did we do wrong. So I do not expect that the successes will be handed to us in some of the ways that it was in 92. I, for one, would be hard-pressed to believe that they would ever showcase a lead speaker at the Republican National Convention the way they did. I think for a lot of people who were on the fence or thinking that it was a simple matter of kind of which way people were voting on choice, had their minds made up when they watched that convention in July. Strategically, it was absolutely the worst move, the worst decision that the Republicans could have made, and they will not make it again. I have to assume they won't make it again. So I really think that the test is going to be in 2 years and then 4 years, because it's not going to be that clear cut. And that I would hope, and certainly didn't campaign on the platform that people should vote for me. One of the phrases I heard, that we've been voting for boobs for a long time, we should finally elect somebody who has real breasts. But the fact is that that's not a reason to elect a candidate any more than voting for someone because of their position on choice. And I think the statistics basically are showing that the choice was a threshold, and for many people was not the deciding factor. We elected a Democrat, anti-choice female in Massachusetts, but I think that people want to know, there are a myriad of issues that were important to people. That was one of them, but I think there's also some feeling that the choice decision is going to be made in Washington by the president or by the courts, and it won't be an issue, but it certainly was not the only one. It's going to be a much more difficult task to sustain what happened, and I don't think that what happened was merely that people went in and women voted for women and men didn't, because that just clearly is not what happened. People were looking for change, and the people that represented change were people who had not been there in any semblance of numbers. And that is going to change, because certainly now next time we're going to be incumbents. So the test will be even a more stringent one. So I think it's not as simple as just that.
Okay. Just a note on qualifications, because we always get into this about women and running as women, and you know, there's a lot of criticism this year about women running as women, people voting for people because they were women. I remind you to take a look at the House and the Senate, and you'll find in its membership all sorts of people who have campaigned as war heroes, all sorts of people who have campaigned as basketball stars or track stars, all sorts of people who have campaigned as ministers, all sorts of people have campaigned based on their experiences in very male dominated professions, and I put that out there, so when women are talking about running as women, I think that's our response to it.
I just have to comment. I had actually had a member of the press say to me at some point during the campaign, "Well, you seem to be running as a woman." I said, "I wasn't aware I had a choice." I mean,
Okay, thank you. I'd love to comment, but I'm moderator, so I'll keep quiet. Over here.
My name is Eve Kaplan. I'm an undergraduate at the college. I have a question for Ms. Wilkerson. I'm wondering if you think about or you plan for how you'll deal with the anger and the frustration that you'll probably feel as being alone as an African American woman in the state Senate, and being faced with people who don't understand the issues as well as you do, and being faced with people who may not treat you the way you'd like to be treated?
The question reminds me about one of my first law interviews. I was trying to get a job when I graduated from law school, and I was interviewing at one of the major law firms in Boston, and the person said to me, "You do understand that if we hire you, you'd be the first African-American female associate, and do you think that you're ready for this?" And I said to him that I have always been African-American, always been female, and I went to Boston College Law School, grew up in Massachusetts, so my environment has always been one in which I was in the minority, and it seems to me that if they never had one of me before, that the question ought to be put to them as to how they're going to deal with me. I'm used to it. And it's not at all to be facetious. It's just to say that I'm a lawyer by profession. There is probably no other profession that is more male-dominated than the practice of law. In January of '91, I became the first African-American female to make partner in a major law firm in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we had the first people admitted to the bar in Massachusetts. So we've got some very recent history. You get used to it. I mean, there are times when I tire of pioneering. I didn't get into this to be the pioneer. I actually didn't know that I was going to be the first. It's certainly something I learned soon after, but I just think that there are going to be so many adjustments that will be made for me working in an environment in which I'm in the minority, in which you have to depend on being able to convince people to do things that they're not used to, is really something you do get used to, and you just don't give up, and you keep trying and hope that you can convert some people in the process. So it's not going to be easy, and I don't want to make it sound like it is, but I'm just saying I'm ready for it, and I think that they're probably spending a whole lot more time figuring out what they're going to do with me than I am with them.
Hi, my name is Diana Yin. I'm an MPP 1 here. This question is directed to any of you, I guess, but particularly Ms. Yeagle, since you just finished, and Ms. Wilkerson, too. In 1996, we are probably going to, well, let's hope, but we're probably going to see a woman running for president. There's some talk about Lynn Martin in '96 on the Republican side and Dianne Feinstein on the Democratic side. My question, I guess, is in terms of the media. The women who have run recently and the women who are about to run in the short term are really the vanguard of women in the spotlight in the media, and it's really the first time that our political reporters have been able to, I guess, test run covering the media. Our perceptions of presidential candidates, on the other hand, are all male, and so they've only had experience covering men. So in 1996, do you think that the coverage for women candidates, if indeed there will be a woman candidate, is going to be decidedly one-sided, and if so, what can you foresee steps in the meantime to correct that perception disturbance, I guess?
Well, I'll just say a word on that. I think it's something we need to talk about, and that it needs to be examined in the media and elsewhere, because I think it is a factor in part that relates to the newness of women in the political scene, but it also is an attitudinal issue. And it's like everything else where we have all of our isms in society. People have to be educated to realize what they're doing. And the only way that I know to do that is to raise those things. And again, I just experienced it firsthand. So, I mean, I could give endless examples of ways that I was treated that were different from the way my opponent was treated or a man would be. And I think part of it is an educational process. So I'm certainly committed to keep talking about it, and hopefully that will help change or help equalize the treatment.
I guess I'm going to try to crystallize it a little bit more. I don't know if I did it the first time. More directly, is the first woman who's going to run for president necessarily going to be the sacrificial lamb? Can we expect to put somebody up who we don't think is going to win and may not have a chance in 4 years hence to win because of her treatment in the media in '96 will be unfair?
Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine anybody, a woman running as a Democrat in 1996 since Bill Clinton just got elected. I mean,
Right.
you know, but personally, and again, this is just me, I don't think we should consider women or anybody else as sacrificial lambs. I mean, I think all of us have to make it our business to change the norm and to change the standards. One thing that I did not mention that has to do with that as well is this mixed message that I think women candidates get. I certainly got it this year. There are like two things going on. One is because I'm a woman, I was expected in some ways to have higher standards, to set higher standards for my campaign, to stay on the high ground and, you know, all this. On the other hand, people were calling up and saying, fight, you got to get in there and throw the mud back, you know, and those things have to be reconciled, and some of those are very individual issues, but I also believe we have to change our standards as a society for political campaigns. And we have to just make it known that we do not accept the kinds of tactics that are full of distortions and lies. And I am very committed to campaign finance reform, which Bill Clinton has said is a big part of his agenda, and is something that I think, again, all of us can make noise about, but that'll help with some of those issues.
I'm adding the positive notes here. I think overall, however, that the women's community, the political community in particular, should feel very good about the overall tremendous amount of coverage that we got in this political season. I can tell you, I've been at this at a long time, and we only had a flurry of coverage, for example, when Pat Schroeder, an 88-minute exploratory bid. After that, nobody, you know, short of the day before Ann Richards got elected to the head of Texas in 1990, no one even really paid much attention. It was sort of sporadic and spotty. We had very, very continual coverage this year, and I think one of the things you'll see with an increase of number of women in the Senate and the House and all across the board is that those wonderful all-white male hours that we watch on Sunday morning are going to begin to be integrated, and so that we're going to see an Andrea Mitchell and a Gwen Ifill and many more women who are going to be talking serious politics with the white boys, and it'll give a different perspective.
I just got the high sign from a source higher than I about the number of questions that we have left, and I was told we have one question left. I know that our panelists will be here to chat informally after this last question over here.
Well, this one shouldn't take too long. My name's Jillian Dickert. I'm a member of the board of the Boston Network for Women in Politics and Government, and I also write cases here in public policy for the Kennedy School. I think we've got some good case studies right up here. If I have my way, we'll be writing about you in the spring. But anyway, my question's mainly for Lynn Yackel. I'm just dying of curiosity to know what you're going to be doing next and what you're thinking about. And if you're not sure, maybe some of the other panelists have an idea.
Well, there are no shortage of suggestions. Let me put it that way. I'm trying not to make any decisions right this minute, although there are a lot of things that are going on. But I'm not going away, let me say that. Having gotten out there, you know, I have learned too much to in any way back away from the political process. And there is so much work to be done. And I really feel that, you know, we all need to do it together. So you will be seeing and hearing more of me for sure.
Very good.
I think she'd be a wonderful member of the cabinet, don't you think?
This has been a wonderful forum. I thank you all for attending, and Lynn Yackel, Diane Wilkerson, Jane Danowitz, thank you for bringing your energy, your enthusiasm, and your great expectations.
And yours. Yours.